guys, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Monique. For those of you who are new to this channel, I upload 1 to 2 videos in a week. So if you have not subscribed yet, I would really appreciate it if you would like to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to click the notification bell button down below so that you'll get notified every time I make a new video. Alright, so today's video is going to be somewhat different than the usual type of videos that I make. It's something that I practice in my wardrobe as well. I don't really shop at fast fashion unless I really have to, or I don't have any choice because I'm in a country where there are no other options for me, like, you know, buying necessities like workout wear or undergarments or things like that. And because of the vintage store that I had in New York, it inspired me to do this video because I find a lot of people don't know the difference between a thrift shop and a vintage shop. And vintage shop owners don't really appreciate their when you go to their stores and say that it's a thrift shop because of these differences, okay? Thrift shop versus vintage store. So a thrift shop is usually owned by a charity, or it is built for a charity. A vintage store is owned by someone, usually a small business person. So thrift shop is usually not for profit, but a vintage store it's a small business, it is for profit. You definitely support the person that has the store whenever you shop at a vintage store. So both of them are really good. They support a good cause in a way, because the thrift shop, it supports a charity cause, and then, you know, a vintage store is usually owned by a small business, so you are really supporting the owner of the business by shopping at the vintage store. So, and the number two, because the thrift shop supports a charity, they get their merchandise from donations from the people in the community. So everything that you see in the stores is donated by people in the community. That's where you tend to find things that are varied in terms of style, era, or quality. And vintage store is curated selection. It's merchandised by the person that owns the store, that goes out there and shop for the store, because every vintage store has different niche. For example, there's one vintage store that focuses on items that are from the 1950s and older. There are vintage store nowadays also that focuses on items from the 90s and the 2000s, because they're really on trend at the moment. So yeah, thrift store, you find a mix of many different merchandise, and vintage store is usually more curated. And also, by definition, vintage means something that is 23 years or older. So you're not going to find, most likely not, it all depends on the person that curate for the shop, you will not find a Zara shirt in a vintage store. So because thrift stores accepts donation, of course it's not curated. It's a mix of everything. There's so many, there's usually a lot of stuff in the store, and a vintage store is usually more curated, more selective. That's why we do get a lot of designers or design teams from fashion houses coming to the vintage vendors when we have vintage shows. You know, vintage shows is like, they have these shows a few times in a year, and they gather many vintage vendors from the area and surrounding, or even from different countries. So it's like in one place, it's like usually 2 days, and people get to come and shop vintage. And usually we get a lot of stylists, design team, or fashion designers, of course, because fashion repeats itself. You know, that's like now the 2000s are really on trend. A few years ago, the 70s were really on trend. So they like to buy things, the actual original garment from that era, as an inspiration for their next collection. It could be the style, it could be the fabric, the embroidery. So everything can be inspiration to these designers. The last thing that I would like to talk about is that because a thrift store accepts donation and they don't curate their selection, of course it tends to be lower in price range. And a vintage store is going to be higher in terms of price range, depending on the value of the item. You know, the more rare an item would be, it's going to be more expensive. For example, if you have a beautiful like flapper dress from the 1920s, which was usually in silk, but you have it in a beautiful condition, no rips, no nothing, it's like almost like immaculate condition, and it has even like beads on it, it would definitely high in price, because we're talking about something that is 100 years old but in a great condition. Or let's say, you know, that Dior newspaper dress from Sex and the City, which is now you can't find anywhere, but if you find it, if a vintage vendor happens to have that dress, it could sell for a crazy amount of money. So if for some people, some customers who probably do not know about this fact often complain about how expensive the vintage stores in New York are. It's because the items that they have are curated, and it is priced depending on how you know, how much they get it for, how rare the item is, how difficult it is to find in the moment. You know, things that are trendy right now, people tend to try to find the vintage version of it, so it usually gets more expensive that way. But of course, every vintage vendor is different. Some vintage stores going to be cheaper than the others, so it's up to you to find. And if you want something that is really low in price, of course you have to spend the time and go to the thrift stores and look for it yourself. So you have lower price range in thrift store, but you're probably going to spend more time looking for what you have in mind. You have to go through so many things in order to find what you want, especially vintage in New York City. It's very overpicked. You know, thrift stores are very overpicked to look for vintage or anything with designers labels on it. But if you don't have the time and you just want to buy something that you like and something that you have on your list, and you go to a vintage store, of course the price is going to be higher. So it all depends on what you need, what your budget is. And yeah, hopefully now that you know the differences between the two stores, you won't be confused when you enter a vintage store and wonder why the price is high. The price is higher than your local thrift shop. Let me know in the comment section down below if you have any question about vintage or thrifting or mindful shopping. And also let me know if you have gone thrift shopping or vintage shopping. What is the best find that you have got from vintage shopping or thrift shopping? Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. I'll see you on my next one. Bye.